Hi, Dr. Becca here. I wanted to talk a moment about prompting. Prompts are something you've probably heard talked about a lot, and there's a variety of different kinds of prompts. We can have a verbal prompt where I am saying, let's say I'm asking what is 2 plus 2, and the learner isn't sure, so they don't say anything, so I prompt them and I say 4, right? So that would be a full verbal prompt. I could also do a partial verbal prompt, right? And again, with that same example for 2 plus 2, I might say, right? And then that would hopefully prompt the learner to say 4. The challenge is verbal prompts are some of the most difficult to fade. They're also the least likely to occur in the natural environment, right? When we're thinking about independence. When we're prompting a learner, it's because we are helping them move towards a correct response, right? Because we want them to get the correct response, whether it's a math problem or responding when somebody says, bless you, or excuse me, or whatever it is. And we also need to be thoughtful about not just them getting the response in that moment, but them getting that response ongoing, right? So them being able to maintain that behavior without any prompting. So we want to be thoughtful about when we're using verbal prompts, because we know that they are the most difficult to fade and also the most likely to become prompt dependent, which means that the learner may sit and wait for a verbal prompt before responding. So in that way, we're actually teaching them to depend on us instead of to be independent. If you think about, let's say, in the school, right? So a child's in a class and they're used to working one-on-one with me, let's say, and I'm using a lot of verbal prompting. When the child goes to the school system or when they're in their gen ed classroom or special education classroom, they may be so used to verbal prompting that what they've learned is not to respond when the teacher says something the first time, but rather to not respond until somebody comes over and gives them a one-on-one verbal prompt. Guys, that's the opposite of what we want. So we want to be really thoughtful about using those verbal prompts. And you might be thinking, well, what am I supposed to do? So we can use gestural prompting. So if you told a learner to clean up the Legos and they've not yet done it, right? So we want to use that delay. We want to wait 3, 5, 8, whatever seconds is appropriate for your learner. Wait. And then usually give the prompt again. But maybe we can try pointing, right? Pointing to what they're supposed to be cleaning up and then waiting. Maybe you can even look at what they're supposed to be cleaning up or what they're supposed to be working on. These prompts are not verbal, right? And it's requiring the learner to really pay attention to his or her surroundings. And for our kids with autism, it's also requiring them to pick up and practice on those nonverbal cues, which can also be an area of growth for our kids. You might be thinking, well, if we know that verbal prompting is the most difficult to fade and can lead to prompt dependency, why do we do it so much? And I think that's a great question, and it's because it's easiest for us, right? And we want to be thoughtful that it's not our therapy, it's not our treatment. You know, the analogy I use a lot of that spotlight, right? Is the spotlight on this person or on me? And remember, in therapy, we want that spotlight to be on the learner. So we shouldn't be doing what's easiest for us. We want to always be intentional about how we're prompting, not just to get to the right response or the correct response, but how can we get to that correct response in the way that is best for that learner. And part of that means how are we setting him or her up to be independently successful without us. It can also happen that we are verbally prompting either because it's easiest for us or because that's what we respond best to, right? But remember, our kids have an impairment as it relates to language. It's one of the diagnostic criteria of ASD. And so we want to be thoughtful that if there's an impairment there, is that the best way to prompt them? in addition to it potentially setting them up for needing more prompting ongoing, or again, we call that prompt dependence. Now, this doesn't mean never use verbal prompts. What it does mean is to be really thoughtful about when and how and why we're using verbal prompts, and that we want to use them sparingly. We want to use, whether it's a textual prompt, so maybe we have a written schedule or written directions for our kids who have literacy skills. Maybe it's a picture schedule or picture directions for our kids who don't yet have literacy skills. We want to use that gestures, right? Pointing, maybe even a partial physical prompt, right? Positional prompts. There's lots of different types of prompting. I think we have another video about that. And specifically today, I want to talk about being really thoughtful and intentional about using those verbal prompts and using them sparingly, because we know that they are the most difficult to fade. We can actually be teaching learners things that we're not intending to teach them, right? Which is, if we're wanting them to comply with a response, but we're giving them lots of verbal prompts after we give that response, we may actually be teaching the learner to not respond when we're giving a direction, because more directions are going to come after that. I hope this is helpful, and if you have any questions, thoughts, feelings, reactions, let me know.